Welcome back to Turpentine VC, a podcast where we discuss the art and science of building successful venture firms, VC to VC. For today's episode, I sit down with Mike Volpi, partner at Index Ventures. We discuss how the firm has evolved, Mike's stance on open source, and their AI strategy. Since we recorded this conversation in late June, Index announced its latest new funds, $2.3 billion of capital, including an $800 million venture fund and a $1.5 billion growth fund. Mike, welcome to Turpentine VC. Thanks for joining the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So Mike, you've been at Index since 2009. I want to start with a broader question. Let's say that I was an active VC in 2008, and then I went into a coma for the next 15 years, 16 years, and then woke up and then asked you, hey, Mike, how has the asset class changed in the last 16 years? What are some of the biggest changes? And I'll kind of refresh your memory a little bit. I'll say, hey, if you were asking me, I might say something like, hey, the asset class has ballooned, has expanded significantly in terms of the amount of capital, the amount of firms, the amount of partners. Seed emerged as a category in a very big way. There's a whole class of seed firms, pre-seed firms. The accelerator, Y Combinator emerged as a pretty big entity. I'd say multi-stage, huge asset aggregator firms like Andreessen Horowitz emerged as a category. Late stage venture emerged in a very big way with companies going public much later. How else would you say the asset class has changed a bit, or what would you add it to my characterization?
Yeah, well, I'd say let's start with the companies themselves, because I think that's probably where it all starts. This is a gross generalization, but pre 2008-9, a lot of venture capital was about technology, about making a technology product of some variety. I worked at Cisco. We made a router or a switch. That was much more common and mainstream. I think in the last 15 years, what we've seen is that technology entrepreneurship has spread into a much larger set of sectors in the economy. Everything from lodging, transportation, real estate, pharmaceuticals, finance, etc. And so what you've seen is a massive expansion of the technology or internet-based entrepreneurship into a variety of sectors that weren't there before, right? And as a result of that, the resulting companies have become, the successful ones have become much bigger than any of us sort of expected. In correspondence with that, what you've seen is the asset class of venture capital has also transformed. And I would say that the big theme is professionalization. So whereas in the 90s and the early 2000s, venture capital was small group of people, small firms, generally on Sand Hill Road. Entrepreneurs came into them to present ideas. They allocated capital. The competitiveness was collegial, let's call it, between the various firms. And now what we see is firms have, as is in the case of professionalism, specialized. You can specialize by stage. You can specialize by sector. You professionalize in terms of all the different things that venture capitalists do. Sourcing was wait for deals to show up. Now is hire armies of people that go out and find companies, that track them, or even use statistical or algorithmic methodologies to do sourcing. If you think about how to do business judgment, venture capital was a lot about, seems like a clever idea, let's put some money in. Now you have oodles of analysis, return expectations, forecasting, deep tech diligence, and so on and so forth, which didn't happen before. The market is, as it professionalized, has gotten more competitive. Firms used to co-lead Series A's. Never happens anymore. It's win-lose, right? So, and of course, in terms of company building, firms have also evolved from being investors to becoming company builders. So you provide services like sales assistance or recruiting or marketing. You do a lot of things to help the portfolio company. So in every dimension, venture capital has become more and more professionalized and created more segmentation in the market, all of which, from the entrepreneur's perspective is good because you get more choice of what the capital comes with. Like the product that you're buying isn't just money, but it is money with X. And that's a good thing for the entrepreneurs.
That's a great overview. And if I were to ask that same question, but now instead of talking about the asset class, talking about Index, and how you guys have evolved over the past 16 years and the decisions that you've made and haven't made in terms of what you decided to do and decided not to do. How would you describe the evolution of the firm?
Well, back when I joined Index, it was Venture Fund 5, and the firm had just raised its first growth fund. It was principally focused in Europe, and it generally used the growth fund to invest in sort of structured, low risk kind of opportunities. I think the total capital managed was under $1 billion. I think in the latest set of funds that were raised a couple of years back, Index is managing over $3 billion. It has three funds: a seed fund, a venture fund, and a growth fund. The obviously the exposure to the North American market had expanded massively. So Index now invests more than half of its capital in the North American market, with an office both in New York and in San Francisco. We cover much more territory than we used to do. The growth fund has gotten more aggressive. So there's been a ton of change at the firm. I would say positioning wise, Index is not one of the largest firms, nor is it terribly small. At 3 billion plus under management, it's obviously sort of what I'd categorize as a mid-sized firm. I think the firm's objective is to have enough scale to be able to swing the bat. So the ability to go after large opportunities, the ability to have a suite of services that provide value to our entrepreneurs. So all of that, we have enough scale to do that. But at the same time, our funds are small enough where we can still be hand delivering from the investors value to the entrepreneurs, to have senior partners on boards, high level of assistance, sort of not being more organic, if you will, in the relationship that we have with the founders. Because when you get too big, you're like a big bank, essentially. And we didn't want to do that. So that's how the firm operates. And I think it suits well our personality and culture.
And say more about why you guys didn't, because you guys have done so well. So you could have aggregated, maybe similar to a Thrive or A16Z or General Catalyst or one of these other firms. But I guess, what do you believe different about the world they do, or what different trade-offs do you think you guys are making by not doing that?
Yeah, our view is that the centerpiece of anything we do starts with the founders and the entrepreneurs. And there is an idea around the intimate relationship between senior members of our index team and the founders that we think makes an enormous difference. I think as you get large, you become a capital allocator. You want to see every possible deal. You want to invest in every possible sector. Your firm grows. When your firm grows, the relationship between its employees and the firm become more employee-like rather than partner-like. You are not able to recruit as high level of talent because each individual has a whole lot less agency in the business. And, most importantly, it's not a familial environment within the firm, which is something that at Index we've always prided. Like we wanted to be a little bit of a family. And so I think that the current strategy and scale allows us to retain kind of the core values of intimacy with the founders and the entrepreneurs at the most senior levels of the firm, and at the same time have enough scale to go after big opportunities. But I do think that we don't think of ourselves as capital allocators. We think of ourselves as company builders. And in some ways, an excess of capital gets in the way of that job. Inevitably, when you have the money, you become a capital allocator. And I just don't think that that's what we do well. And I think it's important for any given firm to know what it does well. That's take nothing away from the capital allocators. That's their job and they do it well. And I think it's a strategy that certainly can produce very good results for them. We just do a different thing.
Right. And when you talk about company builders, what is your perspective on incubations? Is that something that the firm has wanted to build a muscle at? Is that something that you're not as big of a believer in? Is that something you guys do? How do you think about that?
We don't do it. And we don't do it, again, because it doesn't align with our first principle that what we are backing are founders. Founders don't want to be incubated. They are irreverent. They have ideas of their own. They seek our advice when relevant, and sometimes they ignore our advice, which is completely fine. but I think that they come from different walks of life. And we think that we are best able to serve them by meeting them, discovering them through some way of doing things, and then bringing our experience to the table to help them build their business. But I think, you know, underneath the concept of incubation is the basic idea that we know better, and we don't. The entrepreneurs know better, and it is our job to work with them and help them. But it is fundamentally their idea.
Yeah. And let's go back to our original prompt around the person in a coma in 2008 who was an active VC. We talked about the asset class. We talked about index. Now I want to talk about you, Mike Volpi, and how your career has evolved over the past 16 years. Obviously, you've had great success doing companies like Scale and Confluent in Alaska and Aurora and Covariant and others. How have you sort of made a name for yourself or decided to spend your time in VC? How's that evolved over the past 15 years?
Well, for me, a lot has changed. First of all, I didn't think I was going to be a venture capitalist. I started life as an engineer. I did that for a while. Then I did a lot of different other roles, and I did a lot of M&A and corporate investing at Cisco. Then I ran big business units at Cisco. I was CEO of a startup. So I sort of landed on VC kind of later in life, I think, as a second career. I'd say the first thing that I had to do was to learn the differences in the job. I find it interesting nowadays that a lot of people say, like, what's a better VC, an operator or a person that's been in finance? And, I think a good VC is a little bit of a hybrid of both, and you can start from either way. But if you've come from one path like I did, the real task at hand for my first 3-4 years was to learn to be a good venture capitalist. And you're being an operator, or at least having come from a corporate background, there's a lot to learn. There's not a lot of textbooks that tell you, this is how you're going to be a VC. So the act of learning is understanding, how do you identify a great entrepreneur? How do you analyze a market? Once, if it's a competitive dynamic, how do you win an investment? Once you've joined the board, how do you help? Are you directive, not directive? Are you a cheerleader? How, when, what are the moments? All those things take time. I do think it's an artisanal job to do it right. And so you sort of have to practice it a whole bunch to get good at it. I'd say that was a good 3-4 year learning journey for me. The second thing was to develop an understanding of the sectors where I added value more than other sectors. And so during the course of the last 15 years, I've focused myself more on deeper technology that involves enterprise type use cases. I did a lot of infrastructure, open source type investing early on. I got interested in AI in 2015, 16. So I started doing a lot of AI stuff, which is a lot of what I've done recently. But they all sort of fit into an envelope of where I can add value as an investor and as a professional. So understanding that, I've learned a lot and changed a lot my approach on how to build a firm, what the organizational principles are, the concepts are, how people develop, and so forth. And I think I've learned to become a better partner to the entrepreneurs over time, and understanding who they are, what they are about, and in what ways I can contribute to their journey. So definitely evolutionary. And to be honest with you, every day I still learn on how to do this job better. But that's been a lot of change over the last 15 years for me and for the firm.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/turpentine. That's oracle.com/turpentine. oracle.com/turpentine. This episode is brought to you by Warp.
If you're a founder with employees in multiple states, you know managing state tax compliance is complicated. Warp not only automates state tax compliance, but also offers a user-friendly experience tailored to the needs of startups with a robust in-house team of experts. Warp ensures your startup remains compliant across all 50 states, giving you the peace of mind you need to focus on scaling your business. They also make it easy for startups to provide health benefits for employees, hire international contractors, and even claim R&D tax credits. Hundreds of startups trust Warp to handle their payroll and compliance needs. You can go from zero to payroll live in just 2 days. Don't let payroll and compliance hold your startup back. Visit joinwarp.com/peel or tap the link in the description. Get started and receive a $1,000 gift card when you run your very first payroll. That's joinwarp.com/peel.
Say one of the biggest things you've changed your mind about as it relates to how to run a firm or growing a firm or something you believe now that you didn't believe as strongly or didn't fully appreciate earlier in your venture career.
I was good friends with a number of the folks at Benchmark early on. Andy Ratcliffe's still one of my closest friends. And Benchmark had a certain approach, to building a firm. They don't have a lot of underneath structure. It's 5, 6 partners, very collaborative, work as a team, stay small. I think, back in 2009, 10, 11 timeframe, we spent a lot of time with the Benchmark folks and tried to learn and emulate how they did things. And what works for them works incredibly well. In terms of firm building, I think at Index we've realized that that's not us, and that we have to evolve that a little bit. So, give you an example. We don't have just partners. We have a pipeline of talent, which we hire quite young, that oftentimes builds up to that position. I think half of our partners now at Index are people who have come through our organizational structure and made it up to that level. And that works for us. So I think, in that era of firm building, we looked at a firm that was one of the best, and we respected enormously the people that were there, tried to emulate as much as possible, and then came to realize, no, we have to be ourselves. We have to be true to who we are and where we are in the market, and try to build a firm that has our signature as opposed to a copy of somebody else's.
Yeah. They say the next Google or Facebook won't look like Google or Facebook. And similarly, some firms try to imitate Benchmark exactly today, but markets change, and also there already is Benchmark, so it's hard to do exactly what they do. And I guess the pros of sort of the approach that you outlined of how you build up your partners is you get top talent who's sort of emerging in their careers because they see a path to being a partner at Index, whereas Benchmark has to maybe take bets on somewhat already established talent. So just different kind of pros and cons there.
Yeah, I mean, if you some of our partners at Index, Shardul, who's leading our New York office now and has done investments like Datadog and Wiz, was once upon a time an associate that we hired that worked with me. Nina quite well. She came up through the ranks for us. Martin, who's our co-lead in the New York office, came through the ranks. So there's just a lot of people who are at the most senior level now who, they joined us when they were 25 years old or 26 years old, and they've developed. The nice thing about it, as you correctly point out, is you don't just have a culture fit at that point, but you mold people into your culture. So, humans are not static. When they join an organization, they're a certain person, and then as they change and evolve and develop, and you have the pleasure of sort of seeing them evolve into a culture that you set up in the organization, which is what we've done. That's not to say that people aren't hired. I was hired from the outside as a partner for Index, and there's several others at Index who are hired also from the outside. So it's a blend of the two, but I think we gain some key advantages by having that kind of organizational structure to develop people. It's also, by the way, at a purely personal level, it's super fun. I mean, it's one of the great pleasures of, I've been a professional for nearly 40 years. Seeing people show up at age 23 or 24 or 25 and be this little kid, and then 15 years later they're your full partner and they're crushing it, is just a lot. That gives you a lot of joy. It's just, it's an unbelievably satisfying feeling that, like, look at what we've created here.
Yeah, no, it's really inspiring. Give me a tour of of open source a bit. Pretend I'm back in 2008 and I'm saying, wow, over the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be, open source companies that are unicorns, or companies that leverage open source. I didn't think that they could have that commercializability. When you talk about what happened there to enable some of these massive companies that a couple of which you've been a part of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously in 2000, I think we started with my first one was Hortonworks. The general refrain was, how could you ever make money when you give away software for free? Right. That was the basic party line. By the way, I do find it humorous that firms that wrote blog posts about how you could never make money on free software are now leading the charge in AI open source. So I'm like, okay, interesting. Good to change your mind. But I think the first thing in the early days of open source was the process of constructing a business model. And the first business model is very straightforward: is you can have my software for free, but you won't know how to use it. So buy my support services. That was business model one. Not a great business model, not high quality revenue. So then the next idea that came along was, I'll give away most of my software for free, but I'm going to keep some important stuff proprietary, and I will charge you for a bundle of the proprietary bits and services. So that was sort of the next thing. That's generally what companies like Elastic started to build their business on. MongoDB was started in a similar fashion. The next evolution with the advent of cloud, because cloud came about sort of in the 2010 to 2015 timeframe, was, I tell you what, you don't even need to run the software. I have an open source bit of software, but I, the company, will run it for you. It's a cloud hosted service. And all you do is you plug into my APIs. So now, you might want to look at it as open source, but we're really hosted for you. Now, that's a much better business model because it's a subscription where you host your customers' data and you host your customers' computational capabilities. What that generally produces is a company where you have substantially less churn because the customer no longer can say, like, hell with it, I'm just going with the free version, right? Like, they have to stick with you now because you own their data, right? So there you start to see like Elastic Cloud, Mongo's Atlas product, Confluent Cloud, in Databricks, which started with Spark as an open source project, then evolved itself into a cloud hosted version. So the model has evolved now, where what open source fundamentally is, it's a marketing and community development tool. So you put out some open source piece of software and developers show you their love and they build community and they help you build a bit of product. But it is essentially a marketing substitute. The monetization of the business, the core business, is almost all moving to a cloud hosted variant. So you're basically hosting that open source variant and customers are using you via some API. That is a very robust business model. Oftentimes that cloud hosted version also contains some elements of proprietary software. And so the emergence, as you see, as the business model improves from the very early days of support subscriptions to cloud hosted, you see that these companies are now worth tens of billions. So you've got, at 20 billion plus, you have MongoDB, you have Elastic at Confluent. It's sort of like the $10 billion neighborhood. HashiCorp got bought by IBM at 7 or 8 billion. And so you see all of these companies, on Databricks, we know is private, but is worth a lot of money. So all these companies are getting to be worth a lot more value because the quality of the monetized business model has significantly improved. It'll be interesting, by the way, as a side note, because there's this whole theme of open source and AI, and that's got a whole different twist to it, which we can talk about if it's interesting, that sort of will require more transforming of the classical open source model. And it'll be interesting if open source business models can in fact be created in the AI domain. But at least in the normal software domain, that's what's happened and evolved. And I still think it's a super effective business model.
Yeah, so we will get to that. But first, I want to continue to set the table. Remember, I'm in 2008 or 2007. You're talking about cloud emerging. Remind this 2007 coma person how cloud emerged, or why didn't it emerge sooner? Or what were sort of the factors that enabled it to emerge in the way it did?
I mean, pretty straightforward, right? Used to be that I was company A, I had to buy my own servers, had to buy my own storage, had to build my own network, hopefully from Cisco stuff that I sold them. So your IT department, if you were like company X, your IT department was fundamentally spending a large majority of its budget in building foundational stuff, in buying computers, disks, networking gear, and so forth. And then you sort of used applications on top of that. Amazon was building a giant version of that and said, why don't we monetize this and create a product called AWS that basically goes to the company and says, stop buying all that stuff, just buy us as a service, and we'll scale elastically as you need, which was a brilliant idea. Developers in particular, who in the early days were quite unhappy with the slowness of responsivity. So if you and I were coding a project and we needed a server, we'd go to an admin at our company and ask for a server, and they'd be like, okay, we'll get back to you in like 4 weeks and you can have a server. And then you contrast that to AWS, where you can just pop in, use your credit card, and boom, you've got a server. Developers loved it, so that's where it started. As developers loved it, more and more their projects carried weight, and corporations came to the realization that buying and administrating servers and networks and storage didn't make sense. And so they should just buy cloud services. That's when you got AWS. And then their two fast followers, Microsoft and Google, followed up with Azure and GCP and so forth. What's happened since then, of course, is that the big cloud service providers have realized that in order to capture more value from their user, they shouldn't just offer computational storage and networking services, but they should layer on top of that some level of software applications. So initially that was databases, like RDS, for example. You could buy Postgres or MySQL or whatever else. Analytical databases like Redshift. So a whole bunch of caching, CDNs. So now if you go to AWS, you have a plethora of higher level services. Again, the thesis being like, let's just really make it easy for the developer and the enterprise to not have to build foundational elements themselves and just focus on apps. So that over time, that's evolved. Hugely important for our industry, because what it's done is that not only do big companies take advantage from it, but small companies now have the horsepower to build a massive service without having to invest in underlying infrastructure, which is fantastic. And it dramatically accelerates the pace of innovation, product creation, product iteration, and so forth. So just as it's helped big companies, it's helped startups have a huge, huge advantage. And it's created a whole suite of new business models, which are beneficial to everyone.
And, 15 years or whatever the amount in, would you say we're still early to this trend, or is it a mature trend, or how do you think about this wave?
The cloud wave?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're pretty well through it. There are some companies at a certain level of scale that are still like, oh no, I like to build this on my own. And there's a set of reasons why. Some are regulatory, some are NIH, whatever. But I think the vast majority of the technological community is very much at this point embracing cloud, even the bigger companies. And, while there's still going to be some spend on homebrew data centers, I think, they're on a long march back from Russia. It's that wave is over.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Today, I want to make a bit of a personal appeal to anyone working on a SaaS app or website. If you spend any time on the internet, you probably have interacted with chatbots in the bottom right corner of sites. Most are really annoying. AI is making them better, but still I often just get really useless generic answers out of these and end up just wanting to talk to a real human. It felt to me like AI shouldn't just make chatbots marginally better at text responses, but that they should enable a new type of web assistant. Something that feels like you're talking to a human support agent who is co-browsing alongside you. CommandBar is building that user assistant. Companies embed it into their web app, mobile app, or website, and they get a fully generative chatbot that can give personalized responses that refer to a user's past chats, perform actions directly on behalf of the user, like looking up account info, and even start browsing alongside the user to show them how to do something, like a tour guide. It can also nudge users when they seem confused or frustrated. I love when I encounter CommandBar in websites. It's white labeled, but at this point I can tell right away. CommandBar already reaches more than 20 million end users with major customers like HashiCorp, Gusto, Freshworks, 6 Sense, and more. See for yourself at commandbar.com/MOZ or follow the link in the show notes. Hey all, I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the wait list.
You mentioned you got excited about AI or deep in it in 2015 or so. Talk about your journey there, about what got you excited there. What was your evolution, and how do you think about, hey, what types of investments could make sense at what time? Maybe we'll trace us through your evolution there.
Yeah, my original starting point in AI was when I got excited about self-driving cars. I was at a TED Talk. I saw Chris Urmson, who is now CEO of one of our companies, Aurora, give a talk on what is now Waymo. He was at Google at the time. And I was just, I'm a mechanical engineer, I love cars. And I thought, this is the most amazing thing since sliced bread. So it was just purely like, it was cool. Started reading and learning about it, ended up sort of stalking Chris Urmson until we led the Series A in his company, Aurora, and began to learn the fundamental principles. Now, mind you, this is 2016. So the famous attention is all you need paper, transformers, LLMs, distant future thing. At the time, it was about deep learning methodologies applied to computer vision, but it was still very cool. And so that was my entry point. As the more I learned about it, though, I would say what's made it fascinating for me, aside from the whole investment dynamic of it, is it's an absolutely fascinating technology in that it actually mimics the human brain. And, oftentimes when it's hard to understand what's going on with AI, the analogy to the human brain, obviously we know that it works very differently, but as a black box, it's just like the human brain. And I find that intellectually absolutely fascinating. I find it completely fascinating. I found it fascinating then, and even more so now. So it's a super interesting way of thinking about the world. So that, the famous Descartes line, I think, therefore I am, right? So our existence is based on the fact that our brain thinks. And here we are attempting to kind of recreate that as best we can through electrons and chips and all that good stuff. We're trying to recreate the one thing that sort of proves our existence. I find just continuously fascinating. As it's turned out, there's a whole business angle to it, which I'm sure we'll get to. But in first principle, that's what I found super exciting about it. So I started with self-driving cars, invested in Scale, which basically was a supplier to Aurora, and learned a lot about how these models learn and understood the value of something like Scale, which at the time people were like, oh, it's just Mechanical Turk. It's not a very interesting company, blah, blah, blah. Now there's a million people that say, oh, I missed that investment because I didn't, whatever. So
let me stop you there, if okay, because I was lucky also to be an angel in Scale thanks to the Index Scout program, actually. And what did you see that other people didn't, or what gave you the conviction that, hey, this isn't just a Mechanical Turk, this is actually going to be a massive, massive business?
I'd say so. There were two things. I think a lot of people didn't double click on what Scale actually did. So they took the cursory view of like, oh, it's just Mechanical Turk, and didn't understand how much software infrastructure had to be built to translate human labor into an annotated image. There's a lot of software in there. So in other words, the analogy of this would people thought, well, Uber is just Mechanical Turk. And it's not. It's not, because you need some very, very smart software to turn labor, driving labor, into a business, into a global taxi service like Uber. And what I think I was lucky enough is because I understood how some of the mechanics around AI worked, and I obviously had a lot of privilege seeing that as how they were being used at Aurora. And I thought to myself, A, there's a moat. B, this is way bigger than people think. This is not a handful of people. This is millions and millions of images at the time that will need to be labeled and annotated. So I think it was a double clicking on the technology itself and understanding the value added that was being created for sure. And then, the other component is, you meet Alex Wang and you go like, okay, if this guy was setting up a lemonade stand, I'd invest in him. Right. So the combination of the entrepreneur and sort of double clicking of an understanding of the technology, which thankfully I had an inside view of, were what drove to that investment. And thank you for doing the Scout investment in it, by the way. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think people were concerned at the time of, hey, how defensible is this? How big is this? I think they were just in self-driving cars for some time, right? For a few years.
Exactly. Yeah. So scale ended up being, well, they still do. I still think about a quarter or a fifth of its revenue as self-driving vehicles, but as that wave tapered because of market consolidation. If you remember, there were 50 self-driving startups, and then now we have like three. And so essentially the demand compressed. They were lucky enough to inject themselves into the next big wave of AI, which was the LLMs. And that's what's been creating fantastic growth for them over the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, and why did we go from 50 to three self-driving car companies? What precipitated that consolidation?
I mean, look, if you think about it from a pure economics perspective, right? Industries that require very high fixed costs, capital costs, tend to consolidate to a small number of large players. If you think about it like, how many mobile telephone operators there are in a given country, it's usually 3, 4, maybe. How many major airlines exist in a given country? 3, 4. Public utilities, same. Electricity providers, same. Why? All of them have to spend a lot of money to build the basic infrastructure that is required at scale to be competitive in that business. Self-driving cars were the same. You need to have a lot of data. So you need to drive miles or spend a lot of money building simulated data. You need to spend a lot of money developing a sensor suite for the company. You need to spend a lot of money developing different parts of the system. There's a hardware component to it, et cetera. So essentially, building a self-driving vehicle is a very, very expensive baseline proposition. And it doesn't make sense for an industry to have that capital peanut buttered across 10 companies. And so inevitably what happens is that the companies that are better at concentrating that large scale investment into themselves win, and the other ones either go out of business or get acquired and smushed into the smaller number of players. There's a lot of analogies to what's going on in language models today, but I think generally speaking, industries where there's a high fixed cost tends to concentrate to a small number of big players.
Yeah, I was just going to bring it up. The model companies today, it seems like that's.
I think I think you're going to see a similar trend. I think that now there are tens of companies building models. Now I think the airline analogy is apt. You're still going to have like Spirit Airlines over here, and you're going to have some regional carrier over there. So there's going to be some smaller businesses that are based on probably smaller, more commoditized models. But the main players in an industry for language models, given that it's even more capital intensive than self-driving, potentially one of the most capital intensive industries that we've ever seen, I think that you're going to see more consolidation. You're starting to see it happen already currently. If you look at sort of Inflection and a few of the other deals that are announced and unannounced in the market, you're seeing compression happen in the market into a smaller number of players. And I think we're going to see a handful of small players, a small number of players in the industry that are going to be very large companies. So you're going to see the similar trend over the next 2 years.
Let's go back to sort of your evolution of sort of the commercial opportunities of AI. So you do Aurora, you do scale. Take us further into like, what are you noticing are the business opportunities here, and how are you looking at the landscape?
I mean, generally speaking, I kind of, in a very simplistic way, there are three categories of investments in AI. There are the foundation models, which are still happening. Currently they seem to be segmenting various ways. Language, you see people saying like, oh, I have a Japanese model and I have a Korean model, whatever. Size, we have little models, we have big models, and so forth. Coding, like we have models that code well, and so forth. There's a variety of segmentations, but there's a foundation model market. I think it's kind of maturing. I don't know that it makes an enormous amount of sense to invest a lot more in foundation models, but it is a category and there are investments that are continuing to happen there. The second is what I call picks and shovels. These are the scales, the mosaics, the togethers, the et cetera, et cetera. These are companies that essentially provide a set of tools or services which allow model builders, whether they be foundation or enterprise models or whatever, to build their models more effectively, more efficiently. I do think this is a very interesting categories. There's been some early exits. There are some emerging larger and larger companies in the category. And right now, a lot of the model building is happening with the foundation model companies. I do think that you're going to see more enterprises spend their capital resources fine-tuning, training, adapted, constructing applications that are AI based, and they will use a lot of these tools and services to do that. So very interesting investing category. And the third one is what I call AI powered apps. These are Hebbia, Harvey, Glean, et cetera, et cetera. These are the companies that essentially come into a market and they say, we really understand how to use AI effectively to improve your collaboration, your workflow, your productivity. And we're going to build a set of apps which are powered by foundation models, or in some cases, they're powered by open source models that we've adapted to do this. And we're giving you a SaaS application. It's a full-fledged application we're providing you. And that's ultimately, I think that that's going to be the biggest category, because basically SaaS means everything. It has the largest market exposure. SaaS probably that has the largest amount of budget dollars spent by companies against it. It serves small business and large businesses alike. And I think actually you're going to see the largest number of most interesting companies in that third category.
And say more about that, because we saw a bunch of companies in the past few years get to very high revenue numbers immediately, only to not be super defensible once new models were, or new versions were released. How do you think about the types of apps that will have defensibility and staying power over time as the sort of model providers improve and update and get better?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that if your application that you've built is one which is an isolated productivity enhancer, you will, in all likelihood, be more and more commoditized by the core model builders. Because, obviously, core model builders are moving up the stack themselves, right? When I take core model builders, these are, OpenAIs and Anthropics and Google and Cohere and so forth. So they're going to go up the stack. What they won't do, for the time being at least, is focus in on specific workflows that your business needs. I do A in my business, therefore I do B, therefore I do C, therefore I do B, and so forth. Collaboration features. So how do you and I work together with the support of AI to solve a particular enterprise problem? So the more the application incorporates the fundamental business logic and nature of the business it serves, the more differentiated it can be from just being a core model with a wrapper around it. So if what you're using AI for, if your application is like, I'm writing marketing copy and I'm just pinging the GPT-4 to give me marketing copy, which then I ship out, not likely to be particularly defensible. If you are building something where there's 3 layers of management which are collaborating together on a particular document, the document is being enhanced and then it's being passed to an editor and a creator. Imagine like a AI powered Figma kind of a thing. That's much more defensible because the nature of it is woven into and embedded into the workflows and collaboration nature of a given corporation. So that's where I think you create differentiation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chris Pike, a venture capitalist of Pace Capital, wrote this blog post the other day, sort of provocatively titled, I think, "The End of Software." And he was saying, hey, is it possible that what AI is going to do to SaaS is what the internet did to media, which is it made everybody a journalist, basically, or gave everyone the power to create content. And that fundamentally changed the structure of how newspapers operate. And will similarly, the ability to make software become so democratized or so easy that it will fundamentally change sort of the economics of how we think about software. Is there any, I'm not sure if you saw that post, but is there any idea there that you find particularly interesting, or is it, a false analogy?
I, you know, I'll take a step back and say this, right? Making predictions about what AI is going to do is very difficult right now because it's a technology set that's evolving so rapidly in some dimensions and yet is quite stunted in other directions that it's very hard to say like, oh, it'll do this because like this bit of it is improving so quickly, but this bit not improving very quickly at all. So, who knows is the real answer. But I would say that I am not a subscriber to the thesis that there won't be any software developers anymore in 5 years. I do think that AI will enhance the productivity of developers. Part Even the least skilled developers will probably gain the most from AI, and the most skilled developers will probably gain marginally from AI for the foreseeable future. And I would say that today, coding is definitely an area that has benefited a lot. If you sort of talk to customers and talk to developers and you say, well, how much better are you when you use some form of Copilot? 20 to 30% better. Now, that's not a substitution. That's like, when I'm writing emails, I'm 20 to 30% faster because Google gives me the little guess as to what the next piece of the sentence is. But it doesn't replace me writing that email. And I think that the creation of software, if you think about it, has several components to it. One is the comprehension of the logic or the business logic of what you're trying to do with that software. Is this processing a payment? Is this creating a picture? Is this whatever? Why is it creating the picture? What kind of picture does it want to create? What's the intent? All those things are part of building software. The AI can't do that because it's the software developer's prerogative to think about what and how it's going to be done. The second component is architecture. Like, how do you construct, particularly if it's a complex piece of software, how do you construct it to perform in the best possible manner? That is pretty abstracted thinking. And it may be mirrored by other software that is written in the past, but in all likelihood, it still will be done by humans for some period of time. Then there's the acting of actually coding, that like typing. And I think that part of it is probably the area that's most likely to be commoditized. But the notion that, media shrunk, I wouldn't say it disappeared, but it shrunk comprehensively because of the internet is not an analogy that I see associated with this. To be clear, journalists were never particularly well paid. They are even less well paid now. Developers are extremely well paid. And my guess is they will continue to be very well paid into the future. What we will see more of is more software. Because if you think about it, this is a labor market. There's supply and demand. Why do software developers get paid a lot of money? They get paid a lot of money because there's a lot of demand and not enough supply. So when you enhance the supply, one of two things can happen, right? There's a clearing price for that labor. What you might see is if there's more supply, you'll see more software rather than less software engineers. And that's my likely guess, is that software engineers' jobs will change. They will do more of the high level abstracted thinking, but you're not going to see less software developers. In some ways, I like to draw the analogy of banks and ATMs. Bank employees didn't shrink because we got ATMs. They just started doing different kind of labor. And I think that you'll see more and more software developers do value-added labor rather than spending their time typing, which is definitely time consuming and not the most productive thing they can do. So I don't see a parallel there. I see more of a productivity enhancement path forward.
Yeah. And I guess the reason why this didn't happen in media where sort of journalists got paid more is either because demand didn't rise sufficiently to adequately compensate them, or I think more precisely that it just turned out that journalists maybe weren't the best in the world at creating content, and it out emerged this whole creator class of citizen journalists or just online creators or influencers that were the Mr. Beasts of the world, or different kinds that were able to make a lot of money, and a lot more money than anyone was making before.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you think about it from a media perspective, we get information and entertainment from our media. I don't think we consume less of that. We consume different types of it, and the value has shifted to different kinds of platforms. Whereas the old platform was the one that provided newsprint with black ink on it. The new platform is called Facebook. So, but I do think, media organizations 50 years ago were very rich companies. It's just that those have actually, the value has shifted, but you still have very rich media companies out there. The journalist probably was poor back then and is unfortunately poor today. I say this as my mother was a journalist, so with all due respect to the profession, it never paid particularly well.
Yes, some of my best friends are journalists. Yeah, all proper respect. And so the Benchmark has this thesis around, hey, they don't believe that for most of the economy we're going to have this sort of co-pilot model where AI is going to help the person do their job better, like you just described with engineers. They believe more, and I think like sell the work, i.e., it's going to actually replace. And I guess what Devin is trying to do to engineers, but for the broader economy. Do you think what you just described with engineers will be the norm, and there'll really be this co-pilot view of the world across lawyers, doctors, or all sorts of email jobs or professions, or do you think it'll be a split? How do you think it'll play out?
Well, first of all, so I would call what Vishria is saying as a false contrast. I don't think that contrast exists. I think you are going to see both. There is going to be some form of labor which is completely done by AI, and you're going to have some form of labor where the AI enhances or increases the productivity of the individual. Both. I don't see why they are one against the other. There's probably going to be both.
Which is going to be which? Or what's the litmus test to determine which is going to be which? Do you think?
You know, the hardest thing that we do as humans, I think, professionally, is the abstract thinking, the logic that exists in what we do. As an investor, the hardest thing is to recognize the human characteristics of a great entrepreneur and convince that entrepreneur to take your capital, right? Is an AI likely to do that? Not for a while. Not for a while. However, when I want to learn about how RNA development can be improved by AI, I will go to ChatGPT and talk to it for a while. Whereas 5 years ago, I used to go to my analyst and ask them to do research for me. So for sure, my work, my productivity has been massively enhanced by the types of research and learning that I can do when I dialogue with AI, right? But my decision making, and frankly, as a professional, probably the most important thing we ever do is make decisions. Like that's the one thing that we do. I think a lot of those will continue to stay in the human domain. So the more your labor is, I'll call it grinding out stuff, the more likely that that labor will be substituted by AI. And the more your labor is abstract thinking, logic, decision making, the more that's likely to be assisted by AI, but not replaced by AI. And so I think you'll see both, and that's fantastic. It's just it's not like the internet replaced one thing and didn't replace the other. All of our lives change. In some cases, things have been eliminated, like we don't write letters anymore. But in some cases, we use email to keep us more productive.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good framework. Let's return to the intersection of two topics that you've gone very deep on: AI and open source. You were alluding to in the beginning, sort of how AI changes the dynamics of open source and maybe the commerciality of these businesses. Why don't you outline that?
Well, let's go back to the first principles of how does an open source business model, how can it be functional, right? You write some open source software so that you can create adoption for it. Then you build a model where that open source software is hosted and you sell access to it. Typically, the most successful open source models tend to involve some element of computation and some element of storage, right? Like if you think about, what is MongoDB or what is Confluent, it's storage and compute mixed in with a little bit of software on top. And it's a blend of proprietary and closed source and open source software. The challenge in AI, which is very different than the challenge in traditional software, is the cost of compute. You essentially have to train these models. They might be open source, but you have to train them. And the training is super expensive. For a software developer to write some open source code, it's nearly free. It's just my labor of typing. That's it, right? So essentially, the fixed cost of creating open source software is very low. The fixed cost of creating Llama 3 is incredibly high. It's like 5 billion. So if you have to spend that much money in a rational economic world, you have to get return for it. You have to get return for it very, very quickly, right? In the case of Meta, they can choose to do that because they have such a good business on the other side that they can say, never mind, I'm going to put it out for free. But if you don't have that kind of business, why do you put out open source AI software for free? You can do it once or twice, but eventually you have to have a pretty darn good business model around it to keep doing it because of the training costs. And I don't see that right now. Like, Llama 3 is great for Meta, but it's not a great business. And by the way, for the next player to come along and do the thing that's better than Llama 3, or particularly the bigger models, it's super capital intensive. And open source business models tend to be a trickle. Like you monetize a very small part of it. Like if you take a look at Confluent, maybe they monetize 10% of the Kafka universe. So I have a hard time right now comprehending how, with such high training costs, you can construct a open source business model in a realistic time frame that covers that core ongoing cost. To be particularly at the high end of the market, to be competitive, right now you're easily spending at least $500 million a year training costs. And if you do that on a cumulative basis, your revenue has to be gigantoid to cover that cost. If you look at Confluent or Elastic or MongoDB, none of those have that kind of cost upfront, right? So the economics, the math economics, have a much harder time working, I think, in AI than they did in classic open source. So at Index, we haven't invested in a lot of open source AI. We have open weights and a few other things, but it's not clear to us that the business model closes given the compute costs that are required.
And so is Meta doing something irrational, do you think, or do you think they will keep making these gargantuan investments in open source AI, or how do they expect the math to make sense?
Well, it is not totally rational, right? Because when Zuck said, I'm going to spend 10 billion over the next year to build AI, the stock went down a lot. So basically the market is saying, we don't get it. It'll be interesting when the current state of the art is Llama 3 at 70B. The new one that's supposedly rumored to be coming out sometime in July is over 400 billion parameters. There's a variety of rumors as to how much of that is going to be fully open source versus proprietary. Meta may keep putting it out for free. They think they can recover the benefits of the AI stuff through their internal services. So that might be something they continue doing. I don't know. It depends really on their business logic, but it will have a huge impact on the market, because if they continue to do that, right? If they continue to put out very high-end, super performant models in open source, first of all, it decimates the tail of the market, right? Because they're like super good and free. And if you're some other open source developer and you're competing against Meta, who's piling in tons of money and compute resources, very hard to see how that business model works. And so maybe you can sort of snag what Llama's doing and make it a little bit better and sort of kind of keep up with the Joneses, but it's very hard. So I actually think Meta's strategy is fascinating. I don't know what they will do. It sounds like they're going towards a proprietary path. We'll see. If they don't, they are the open source play. I think it's very, very hard for anybody else to compete with the resources they're going to deploy against this thing.
Yeah, that's tough for Mistral and Stability and others that are trying perhaps.
But even Mistral, like Mistral Large, which is their big model, is proprietary, right? So they clearly have figured it out, and they're going to monetize through a proprietary path.
Got it. Last question. You mentioned picks and shovels, foundation models, applications. You're most excited about applications. Do you have any requests for startups or applications that you think are underexplored, or you think could be big opportunities for entrepreneurs listening, or things that you'd potentially be excited to go deeper on or explore?
I've a lot of fun things that I think we could look at. First, in the language arena, I think that, if you think about SaaS, there's usually two axes to it. One is SaaS that is specific to a given industry, right? Harvey does law, for example. Hebbia does financial services. But there's a lot of interesting vertical industries. So thinking about pharmaceuticals, construction, travel, etc. How can AI be used to build applications that are specific to an industry and have an industry workflow built into it? Would love to see more of those. The other one is more of the functional applications. So applications in sales, CRM, marketing, finance, human resources, etc. There are incumbents in those businesses. You have a Workday and a Salesforce, but none of them are AI native. And so the question is, can you build an AI native functional application? I think those are super interesting. What I see a lot of right now are productivity applications, which are good, but I think generally you'll see more value in either functional or vertical application. There are winners in productivity, but not as much as you see in the other categories. Would love to see more of that. I'd love to see some of this AI technology being used outside of the classic language domain. Recently, I've seen a couple of things around weather forecasting that use deep learning or AI, which would be absolutely fascinating. There are use cases around supply chain, which I think could be super, super interesting. Essentially, if you think about what AI really is, it's a pattern matcher. When in language, there's a lot of patterns, so it can match them very effectively. But there's many, many things in the world that have patterns that AI can be used to match. And the core technology could very well be just transformers, but transformers applied to different things is a sector that I'm super interested in. And then the last bit, which we like quite a lot, are smaller models, interesting smaller models that alternative architecture, so non-transformers. The problem with transformers as a VC is that it favors the largest because it's such a compute game. And, I watch the Apple announcements with interest because they're obviously showing the potential of small models. And I think that that's another sort of interesting area. So lots and lots of stuff that we can go take a look at.
Great. That's a great overview. And are you a believer, like Vinod, that the cost of compute is just all this competition is going to lead to the cost just precipitating, going significantly down?
I think Moore's law is Moore's law, so I think we're going to see it drop by a factor of 2 every 2 years. The recent trends on reduction, particularly in GPUs, has been more dramatic because GPUs were being used for graphics and then they were reapplied to crypto and then reapplied to AI. So there was very little forethought, even within NVIDIA, to explicitly target their chips for AI usage. Now that they are doing that, I think you've seen a pretty significant drop, but eventually I think, it's transistor counts and you're going to see Moore's law. And that's good, by the way. Factor reduction of 2x every 18 months is really, really good. And so we're all going to hugely, hugely benefit from it. But it isn't a precipitous drop. It's sort of the similar drop that we've seen in compute for a long time.
That's a good note to end. Before I wrap up, I always just ask my guests, is there anything I forgot to mention or we forgot to get into that you think we should, or does this seem like a good place to wrap?
I mean, we could talk about this stuff for forever. There's a lot of fascinating things, and our world is changing a lot. But yeah, I mean, we could talk about non-AI venture and what happens to that. That would be an interesting theme. But overall, I think we covered a lot of good topics.
Yeah. No, yeah, this was a great conversation. For entrepreneurs listening to this, you'd be very lucky to have Index as a potential partner. Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your learnings and wisdom with us.
Pleasure, Erik. It was great chatting with you.
Turpentine VC is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen and Econ 102. If you liked the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store or rate us on Spotify.